Yes, hello to all once again, and another warm welcome back to Classic Dirt Bike TV. It's Chris here again with more of those old school, long lost vintage racers from a way back in the day. Now, this next featured bike is another Italian based machine. Now, you may remember we showcased a 1982 Ancillotti pull shock 250 just recently. So this is another rendition of an earlier bike from this manufacturer. So let's dive straight into that video now and take a look at this 1980 Ancillotti 250 high roll twin shock race bike. Okay, now just before we get down to our featured classic, a little bit of background here on the owner of the bike, who is this man here, Terry Pickering, who lives in the south of England. And since Terry sold his business, he now spends most of his spare time restoring old classic dirt bikes. And when Terry doesn't have the time to refurbish them himself, then he gets his old mate and close friend Keith Ree to help him out. But Classic Dirt Bike TV have visited Terry's fantastic collection of dirt racers on numerous occasions, and these few machines that we're taking a look at here are just a few of Terry's bikes, some of which have had some light cosmetic restorations, while others have had complete refurbishments, and they're more or less now like brand new bikes once again. But on the other hand, also included in Terry's collection, he also has a few ultra rare specimens, one of which we're going to take a look at just shortly. And Terry's private dirt bike collection is fast turning into one of the rarest and interesting compendium of old school motocross classics in the country. And I've already scheduled a further visit to Terry's premises so that we can feature more of his fantastic machines here on my channel. So as you can see, Terry has quite a nice collection of old classic and ultra rare motocross machines. Which now of course brings us on to our featured bike from Terry's museum of interesting vintage race bikes. And this example here is an Italian 1980 Ancillotti 250 twin shocker. Now, I expect that you're already looking and thinking about what a great job Terry's made of this bike's restoration, although unfortunately there's actually never been a spanner laid on this bike since it left Ancillotti HQ in Italy in 1980, because this is a brand new unused bike from that year that hasn't even had a drop of fuel put into its tank, and it hasn't even been started since it rolled off the factory production line in that year. So in terms of its rarity and originality, you're never going to find a finer example of a motocross dirt bike time capsule. Anyhow, the story goes that when Terry first bought this bike, it was in exactly the very same condition that you see here, and this bike was said to be part of a collection of similar classics that were owned by a private collector in Belgium, who in the 1980s spent most of his time patrolling off-road bike dealerships and buying up new unsold machines at knockdown prices. And Terry told me that when he visited this aforementioned collector's premises to pick up this bike, he told me that the seller had an absolute warehouse full of brand new original motocrossers from the 1980s, all kept in an air-conditioned building, which is probably why this bike here is in such a remarkable condition, with absolutely no rust or metal corrosion of any of its parts. Although I can only imagine what other classics that Belgian seller had in his possession, and if they're in as good condition as our Ancillotti here, then you can imagine that he's sitting on an absolute goldmine of rare and classic motocross museum pieces. But let's just take a closer look at this rare timepiece, beginning with its frame or chassis, which was made from light gauge tubular steel that had a twin cradle-like construction that ran underneath this engine. But this chassis was without doubt very strong and light enough to throw around a racetrack, although there's no need to look for wear and tear on this Italian motorcycle skeleton, because you're never going to find any, due to the fact that this bike is still awaiting its first adventure with mud, and the chances are that it'll never happen, because I think this is just too good and rare a machine to put it back on a track, and I'm sure it has much more historical and rarity value seeing it here in its virgin condition from 1980. Now, I know for a fact that Terry has displayed this bike at the Telford Classic Dirt Bike Show on numerous occasions in the past, and almost every year there just seems to be a bike collector somewhere trying to buy up this machine to add it to their own personal collection of bikes. And as I recall, in 2023, I think somebody had offered Terry £10,000 for this bike, but naturally Terry turned it down, because he wants to keep this particular rare item locked up safe and sound among some of the other rare machines in his Aladdin's cave of motorcycle memorabilia. But moving on to the power plant of our Italian Ancillotti, and it's no surprise to find that it's powered by an Italian-made Hyro two-stroke motor, which, as you can gather, is an air-cooled piston port engine that actually Hyro supplied not only to Ancillotti but to a host of other motorcycle manufacturers, including Aprilia and Cagiva, TGM, and many others around Central Europe. And even the great Alan Clues of CCM used these 250cc engines in the 1979 and 1980 motocross machines. But these Hyros were certainly very popular for their day, because they were reasonably powerful and light and quite easy to maintain, and of course readily available, so it's little wonder that other manufacturers found them ideal for these lighter motocross enduro or even trials machines. Now, inside this engine you had a 6-speed gearbox, so there was plenty cogs in there to keep your left foot busy, knocking up and down that transmission shifter. But every time I look at this engine, I always seem to get the impression that there's a casing cover missing from this side of the motor, because there certainly appears to be a couple of fixing points there for at least a primary sprocket cover, although I've also seen other examples of this air-cooled Hyro engine with this very same look on this side of the motor, so maybe it wasn't meant to have a casing here at all originally, but it's quite baffling that there are similar engines with this same type of configuration. But while we're still on this side of the engine, all of the sparks for that single cylinder Hyro motor were supplied by a Motoplat ignition system, which for 1980 was said to be a very reliable, tried and tested system, and I'm pretty sure that this ignition system was also used on the old Myco racers back then, so it should be able to cope quite well on this Italian-based Ancillotti. Now, you would certainly think that a fully thoroughbred Italian race bike would also be fuelled by an Italian carburetor, like maybe a Dell'Orto or something similar, but not on our Hyro engine's case, which used a Japanese Mikuni to feed that engine with its fuel and air mix. Although, having said that, these Mikunis are pretty much indestructible and quite easily tunable, which is most probably why Hyro chose them in the first place. And normally the air for that Mikuni carburetor was drawn through a foam filter that was housed inside this black plastic airbox, and naturally the filter was fully washable and reusable, and normally accessed from the rear of this airbox through a round circular access panel that was just in front of that rear wheel. But once again, the Hyro engine's clutch was just a simple wet oil-cooled multi-plate unit that thankfully was connected to the crankshaft by a gear-driven cog, and not an old-school primary chain like the old Twinshocker Micos of its day. But as I said, these Italian Hyro engines were very well made and pretty robust, which of course made them absolutely perfect for off-road use. But to get them fired up, it was usually just a quick dab that was required on this kicker, although our Virgin Hyro engine is still awaiting that particular experience. But to keep the actual weight of the 250 Hyro engine respectable, this cylinder barrel and its head were made from alloy, and the cylinder also had these rubber buffers between the fins to try and reduce that vibration when the motor was revved hard. But the condition of all of the metal parts on this bike is just amazing after 41 years, and parts like these footrests look like they were only made this morning, because they've absolutely no signs of corrosion or furring of their surfaces, probably all due to the bike being kept in an air-conditioned building. And once again, when you look at the Ancillotti's exhaust expansion chamber, it looks like somebody's just taken it out of the wrapper and then bolted it onto the bike. And you can see that Ancillotti even manufactured their own pipes with their logo stamped on it here. But again, you'll not find any dings or dents or abrasions on this pipe, although there might be a couple of spiders maybe making a web inside it after the bike's been mothballed for the last 41 years. But this pipe's condition is everything that you'd expect from a motorcycle that's never been used in all those years. And I did ask Terry at the time if he'd like to christen the bike by starting it up, but as you'd expect, he immediately declined, because I suppose once this engine's been started, then it will lose all of its rarity and prestige and just become another second-hand Twinshocker race bike. Now, as we move on to the back of the bike, as you can see, it was another Italian manufactured SEM alloy tailpipe here at the rear, and SEM were yet another one of the Italian manufacturers who made and supplied these alloy silencers to some of the other Italian bike builders of their day, including Cagiva, TGM and a few others. But again, these were very good quality items and super light as well, and as far as I'm aware, these tailpipes could be dismantled so that they could then be repacked with new exhaust fibre. Although it would have been quite good to have had a listen to that Hyro motor through this tailpipe, but as I mentioned, in this particular case, I don't think that that's ever going to happen. Although, as a motocross two-stroke power plant, these air-cooled Hyro engines certainly did their job very well, and almost a year or two later, Hyro would upgrade the range of motocross engines to include liquid cooling. But in 1986, they would then cease production of motorcycle engines altogether. Now, as we move on to the front end of our Ancillotti, it was more Italian-based components, and these Marzocchi forks were pretty much a standard fitting on most Italian off-road bikes of that period, with again the likes of TGM, Aprilia, and even the Italian Frigerio Puch 250 used these front forks on their bikes. But for the early 1980s, these Marzoccis were still considered good suspension systems for their time, which is why they were used on a multitude of different off-roaders of that period. And even the British built Cotton EMC or EMXs used these front suspension systems on their British built race machines. And as you can see, the condition of the forks on this Ancillotti is still quite remarkable after 41 years, with absolutely no corrosion, rust or other metal-eating organisms attacking their surfaces. So well done to the previous owner, who certainly knew how to keep a bike in prime condition and be able to store it properly for so many years. Now, as with many off-road bikes of the 1980s period, Ancillotti were also using these old-school cable-operated drum brakes on their bikes, which were pretty much the standard stopping units for motorcycles of this kind. And because our 250 Anci wasn't exactly a heavy bike, these drum brakes were plenty adequate until much more modern hydraulic disc brakes came along a couple of years later down the line. And also at the back end of the bike, this rear drum brake once again was just another simple drum type affair, although both of that front and rear brakes might certainly take a little bit of bedding in, because I expect that the brakes will be like brand new inside these hubs, not having had to slow the bike down as it's never been ridden. Although these brakes may have had a slight twitch on them once or twice while it's being pushed in and out of Terry's shed. Now, you're all more than likely just sitting there looking at your screens and immediately thinking that these gold anodized alloy wheels are brand new replacements, judging by their condition. Although I'm sorry to disappoint you again, because these Spanish-made Accurant wheels are exactly the same parts that Ancillotti bolted onto this bike back in 1980. And I know it certainly looks like they were only re-spoked this morning, but without question, these wheels here and their spokes are the genuine 1980 article. And you can actually see further evidence that this rear wheel sprocket and chain have never even been driven by that Hyro engine by taking a look at the condition of the sprocket's teeth and their chain sockets, which, as you can see, all look like brand new. And as we move on to the Ancillotti's rear swing arm, which was an alloy item, and as you can see, this swing arm was called the rear fork controlled strength unit, which was also highly polished, which is exactly how these swing arms left the Ancillotti factory in the 1980s. And I think Ancillotti's thinking was that by polishing these alloy swing arms, it added a little bit of bling and it made the bike a bit more attractive to potential buyers. But then again, it is an Italian bike, so it's bound to try and make itself more attractive, because that's of course what the Italians do. But these alloy swing arms were certainly very strong, and they didn't have too much flex at the rear end, and these alloy parts were naturally much lighter and more attractive than their heavier and duller steel counterparts. Now onto the back end of our vintage Italian stallion. It was also another Italian manufactured pair of rear shocks with these Corti and Cosso piggyback suspension units. And once more, these are also the exact same shocks that the bike came with in 1980 from Ancillotti HQ. Now, Corti Cosso never really had a great reputation for the quality of their suspension systems, and in fact I think riders often commented back in the day that certain models of Corti Cosso shocks were only really good enough to hold up the back of the bike while it was sitting on the showroom floor. And once owners first bought a bike with those Corti Cossos fitted on the back, it was usually one of the first things that they replaced before putting the bike onto a track. But don't get me wrong here, because there were other models of Corti Cossos that still did a good enough job, and I expect that these piggybacks here were reasonably good and performed pretty well enough on this light two-stroke scrambler. And of course, the other factor to consider here is that this was 41 years ago, and motocross suspension has certainly moved on in leaps and bounds since then. So I suppose for 1980, these suspensions could have been considered the top technology of their day. Anyhow, moving on to the front of our Terry Pickering bike, it was a plastic fuel tank that was fitted to these Ancillottis in 1980, because by this time most off-road bike manufacturers had all moved away from the older steel or alloy tanks, which were of course heavier and more expensive to produce, whereas these lighter and less expensive plastic tanks were much more suitable for motocross racing. And as you'd expect, our featured plastic fuel tank is still waiting on its first drop of gas to be dropped into the tank, which is again another virgin part that's yet to be commissioned. But back in the day, these fuel cells would have more than likely held about 1.5 gallons of two-stroke premix, which would have probably been more than enough to keep that Hyro 250 motor spinning along quite happily. But not only is the plastic of this tank in superb condition with absolutely no fading whatsoever, the Ancillotti's graphics on the side are still factory fresh as well. But this tank was also slim enough to keep the bike's profile as narrow as possible. But moving on to our Ancillotti's seat, which is also as fresh as the day it was fitted onto the bike, which isn't surprising considering that nobody's slung their leg over the seat in 40 odd years. But these racing seats were certainly long enough and comfortable enough to enable the rider to move their weight across the bike, and they had just about enough padding to compensate for the harsh ride that the rider received from those corticoso shocks that were fitted on to the back of the bike. Now, even when you take a bit of time to walk around all of the plastic parts on this rear bike, you expect to see at least some partial fading of the panels and things like mudguards, etc. But you can see that these are all still factory fresh and as good as the day that someone screwed them on to the bike during its production. Although, as I mentioned, I don't have exact details on just how this bike's been stored for the last 40 years, but whoever has had that task certainly knew how to preserve and keep the bike and these plastic parts in particular all in perfect condition. And as we move on to the control centre of our 250 Italian Twinshocker, now all of the handlebars, grips, levers and cables are again all the stock parts from its production year, and the bike even has its original Ancillotti leather lever covers there, as you can see, and the handlebars again are the proper ANSI items, which you can always tell if these are original or not, because that crossbar is always welded on and not bolted by a clamp like you have on modern motocrossers. But again, everything is unused and original, as you'd expect on a bike with these kind of virgin credentials. And who knows, maybe even sometime in the future, this Italian manufactured Tomaselli twist grip gasser will maybe one day get the chance to control the engine speed from that 250 Hyro power plant. But then again, probably not. Although it's certainly not every day that you come across such an original, unused, unstarted and virgin example of what is already a very rare motorcycle specimen from that 1980s era, because in their native Italy, these Ancillottis were quite common bikes to see at Italian motocross race events, although here in the UK these Ancillottis were virtually unheard of, which I think was also the case internationally, because very few of these bikes were shipped abroad. So what we're looking at here is without doubt a motorcycle time capsule, and if you walked into a motocross dealership in Italy in 1980, then this is exactly what you would have seen when you entered the shop. And back then, if you were a young, impressionable teenager, maybe looking for your next bike and were confronted by a machine such as this, then it's little wonder that these bikes were so popular. So, just exactly what lies in store for this rare Italian specimen? Well, not much really, because as far as I know, Terry's absolutely no intention of putting this bike back onto a track. And as I said earlier, if you were to eventually start this bike and run it and then race it, then it all becomes just another second-hand Italian Twinshocker that would probably not be worth a lot of money. But in this brand new, unused condition, as far as I'm concerned, this has been a very astute purchase by Terry, which I'm pretty sure is only going to increase in value as the years roll by. Okay, so coming up next here on CDB TV, we're going to take a look at another British Clues classic, and this particular bike here belongs to Rob Hughes, and this is Rob's lovely, fully restored 1978 example. So we'll be taking a look at this bike when we return to CDB TV. But for the time being, thanks once again for watching my video content. I hope to see you back here again very soon so we can talk about more of these old school vintage racers right here on your number one and favourite Classic Dirt Bike TV channel.